Hello, this is Dr. Ken with a lecture from my Greek history class titled Who Were the Greeks? It is for them and they will have the notes and slides, but in the great spirit of democratic Athens, any who wish may observe this if they want. The topic today is Who were the Greeks? So this is a way of introducing the course or the module to my students, and we'll go over the various groups of people who have occupied Greece, including the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, at the end of the Bronze Age, and the Dark Age Greeks, followed by the later Greeks that we think of as the ancient or classical ones. I'll be going through the different periods of history that we're concerned with as well. We're mainly focusing on 5th century Athens, 5th to 4th century Athens, but it's important to know the origins of some of these things as well. So, the first group of people we'll talk about who occupied Greece, or Hellas, were the Minoans. These were a Bronze Age civilization that arose on the island of Crete originally, and came to dominate the shores and islands of the Aegean Sea. Their civilization flourished as a maritime power from about the 27th century BC to about the 15th century. We had literary references to this civilization, but they were only sort of properly rediscovered in the early 20th century by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans. It's been considered the civilization is the first link in the European chain. They have connections with Egypt, which you can see in some of the artwork that survives from them, but they are distinct from the Egyptians. And I put in the notes quite a bit about the archaeology of the Minoans. It looks as if some kind of settlement existed on Crete from as far back as the 8th or 7th millennia BC, but it wasn't until about the 27th century or so that we start getting signs of a more sophisticated civilization, and they sort of crash onto the scene in a major way because the Minoans are palace building, mercantile, and develop quite a significant trading empire. They appear to have been primarily mercantile, engaging in overseas trade. From about 1700 BC on, where they show a high degree of organization. Many archaeologists and historians believe the Minoans were involved in the Bronze Age's most important trade, that tin alloyed with copper, which produced bronze. This was the substance of choice in the Bronze Age, and used for all manner of weapons and tools. They also traded in saffron, an herb that even today is worth more than its weight in gold. Minoan trade in saffron originated in the Aegean Basin as a natural, the plant originates in the Aegean Basin as a natural mutation, and it seems to have been a mainstay of their trade, especially in luxury goods throughout their empire. And you can see from the map that I'm putting up, it's quite extensive, the settlements and the trade network of the Minoan civilization. This is a very sophisticated culture. It's unfortunate we don't know more about it than we do. They produced a high level of artistic accomplishment, which you can see in some of the works of art. And as I say, they were a palace-building society. The ruins of the palace at Knossos have been more or less excavated on Crete. There are others as well. What's interesting is that unlike the Mycenaeans, who come along later, the Minoan palaces don't appear to have been heavily fortified, at least not to the same degree, and that suggests a relatively peaceful civilization as well. We don't know a lot about, the writings that survive from the Minoan period have not been translated. They are a form of Greek, but they've never been fully deciphered, so we don't know what the Minoans had to say about themselves. There appear to be lots of evidence of religion amongst the Minoans, and a religion that seemed to focus on female deities. with women officiating as well. This, along with other evidence, has led scholars to believe that probably the Minoan culture was more equal in terms of male and female than, pardon me, some of the later cultures that would develop. So I've put on the slide, which you'll be able to see, different periods of Minoan history. I'm not going to go into all the details of that now. Essentially, it can be divided up into pre-palatial, proto-palatial, neo-palatial, and post-palatial periods, so all around the sort of subject of palace building. What concluded the Minoan civilization, the ending of their society, is controversial. It has to do with potentially a volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini, although the dates don't precisely coincide. So it's one thought is that a tidal wave was responsible for wiping out their capital, if you like, but we're not sure. In terms of, again, art and architecture, fairly sophisticated stuff for the time, lots of jewelry. You can see in the slide some examples of Minoan writing, which again have not yet been deciphered, and some of the artwork that survives on frescoes. And of course, what we have of their artwork is probably the poor cousin of what was actually present during their heyday. Lots of pottery. Usually with sort of sea creature designs on them, octopuses, shellfish, things like that, dolphins, very popular. There's also metal, stone, ivory, and faience work, gold rings and seals and other such things. As I mentioned, the civilization goes into decline, roughly corresponding, well, not quite with the end of the Bronze Age. The next civilizations, the Mycenaeans, their end will be the end of the Bronze Age, but something seems to have happened that resulted in a collapse of their trade networks, and Minoan cities show indication, those that have been excavated, show signs of famine. The grain supplies believed to have come from mainly the Black Sea region, rather, the shores of the Black Sea, and something interrupted that. I mean, obviously, something like a famine could have been the result of climate change. Archaeologists, scholars believe that the trading empire was very sort of tenuously. It was based on sort of a number of things happening, all the time, that any of which could have upset the trading network, although surprisingly it survived as long as it did. One theory is that even though the Iron Age doesn't happen until sometime after the fall of the Minoan civilization, there's an increase in the use of iron tools, and that might have had an impact on this heavily Bronze Age invested society. As I mentioned, the eruption of Thera, or Santorini, as it's called, may have had an impact. This is controversial. The radiocarbon date of the eruption is about 1628 BC, but the fall of the Minoan civilization is about 1450 BC. So we're talking, a good 200 years, more than 200 years since that eruption, that the civilization falls. Was it a factor? Entirely possible. But was it the cause? It's hard to say. It may have been one of several factors that caused the decline of the civilization. The Minoan Greeks would then be replaced by the next civilization to come along, known as the Mycenaeans. So they flourished during the period roughly of about 1600 BC onwards. So their civilization is rising as the Minoan civilization is falling, to about 1100 BC, when it perished in the collapse that occurred at the end of the Bronze Age. There were a lot of collapses of civilizations around this time. The Hittites were another example of this. They're very different in character, the Mycenaeans, from the Minoans. They dominate the Mediterranean from about 1450 to 1200 BC, and clearly had an impact on the Greeks that would come later. In fact, the ones that Homer was composing about for the Iliad and Odyssey, they are the Mycenaean Greeks. Homer did not live in the Mycenaean era. He's from about the 8th or 7th century, 8th or 9th century rather, BC. He's recording oral histories and recollected memories and adapting them for his own Archaic Age from the Bronze Age. So the names of peoples, gods, heroes have all been preserved in Homer. They might well have been real people whose deeds were recorded in song. So Agamemnon, whom we'll be getting to know before long, Menelaus, Odysseus, people who descended from the gods allegedly. These are all remnants of the Mycenaean Age. There are several, and as you see, they are also a palace building society, somewhat less sophisticated in their artwork, and probably their technology as well, apart from the military technology, which seems to have been better to that of the Minoans. But they built fortified palaces. And many of the ancient Greek cities, like Athens, in fact, will have gotten their start from a Mycenaean fortified palace on a hill, usually, that forms the nucleus of a new community. You can see examples of some of their artwork in the slide. And the next set of slides that I'm going to show you, or a group of them, come from Mycenae itself. Mycenae was probably their largest settlement in mainland Greece. This is where Agamemnon had his palace, supposedly. And you can see a reconstruction of it here. Well fortified, with a sort of almost medieval, with a curtain wall around it, and within the curtain wall the various workmen and things that would be needed to sustain the palace culture. So it's on a hill, which you should be able to see quite clearly there, and with a view of the sea as well, so ships can be spotted coming in. Heavily fortified, that's the Lion Gate in the next picture that I'm showing, through which one had to enter in order to get into the palace complex. It's a different sort of architecture, although obviously loosely based on the Minoan civilization. Clearly the Mycenaeans had some contact with the Minoans. They are probably descended from them in some sense, though it's not clear exactly how that worked. The language the Mycenaeans use is also, it's derived, well, the language itself is an early form of Greek, and it has been translated. Their writing system is derived partly from the Minoan, rather, and it has been deciphered by a man named Michael Ventris in the 1950s. Ventris was working on Minoan language, but never quite managed to get it sorted out. So there, and you can see a reconstruction of what that palace complex would have looked like. And the next several slides show you what's sometimes called the treasury of Atreus, so the house of Atreides, of which Agamemnon was a member. It's a tomb complex outside of Mycenae. It's not in the city, but outside it, where the kings were buried. And this is where I believe it was Schliemann who later discovered Troy as well, found this gold mask, which was a burial mask for a king, and said, I've looked upon the face of Agamemnon. Well, it probably wasn't the face of Agamemnon necessarily. It might have been one of his relatives. We don't know. But you can see some images here from the excavated tomb complex. Again, sort of almost, fairly sophisticated architecture, but again more primitive in some respects than what the Minoans were able to produce. The Mycenaean civilization, as you can tell from the map in the earlier slide, is somewhat less grand than the Minoan. It's not as extensive. It's mainly based around places like Pylos, Argos, Mycenae. There's a site in Athens and Thebes. and Iolcus, and at Knossos as well. But it's a smaller and a more, we think, a more warrior-based society. It's the Mycenaeans who go and attack Troy. There was a Troy, there was a Trojan War. It probably wasn't started over Helen of Troy. Who knows? Maybe she was a real person. Maybe she had something to do with it. But it was more like a kind of, we think, a kind of almost Viking-style raid, because Troy was a wealthy city, a sophisticated city. It had lots of gold and silver, things the Greeks at this time lacked. And so we know that they were attacked by the Greeks, by the Mycenaean Greeks, and probably it was, as I say, a raid for resources. The civilization was not unified in the same sense that we think the Minoan civilization was. It seems to have been more, well, several kingdoms, sometimes aligned with each other, perhaps sometimes fighting each other. And you can see some of the examples of artwork that I put up in the slide, and pottery. It's less sophisticated than what you would find from the Minoan period. It's geometric in shape, we call it, geometric in design. It appears to be an era of decline, a kind of aftermath of the Minoan civilization, and not as long-lived, as I say, as well. As to what causes it to go into decline, well, it seems to have been several things. One is the end of the Bronze Age, which, again, their whole economy, their whole technology is based on bronze. As iron weapons and tools become more widely used, that's a factor. There's also a migration of peoples around this time, different groups of people. One is called the Sea Peoples. Are they invaders? Are they just migrants? It's hard to say. They're coming in through the Mediterranean Sea, probably from the east, and in fact, they're the ones who will bring what will eventually become the Greek alphabet. It is a Semitic alphabet deriving from the region of Palestine, what's Palestine today. They're possibly part of the reason for the fall of this civilization. There's another theory that it was brought on by a rejection of the palatial system, by the most underprivileged strata of society. So kind of revolutions going on within society where they're resisting the palaces and their authority. But again, the beginning of the Iron Age, what happens is it's not just new weapons and tools and iron. The use of weapons and tools, the use of tools and iron make bronze tools much cheaper, much easier to obtain. And this upsets the whole of the economy. So by the last years of the 12th century, the Mycenaean civilization is effectively gone. And they're not replaced right away. There's a kind of power vacuum. And we refer to this period roughly from about 1200 to about 800 BC as the Greek Dark Ages. Dark in the sense that we just don't know what happened. It doesn't look as if a particularly sophisticated culture existed at the time. You can see in the picture some examples of Dark Age pottery and art, again, even more primitive than what the Mycenaeans had compared to, say, the Minoans. This appears to be an era of kings, but small kings, sort of tribal chieftains almost. And again, it seems to be a time in which civilization is regrouping. The seeds are being planted for something new to come along. Geometric patterns dominate the pottery, very simple designs. And again, like I say, it's dark mainly because we don't know what happened. There's no text to tell us, unfortunately. I said that Mycenaean texts had been translated. Mostly what they consisted of were lists of what the king owned. So that's the kind of writing that survives from the Mycenaean period. We assume that if any survived from the Dark Ages, that's probably what it would contain as well. We don't know. But the next era to come along, we're getting into something a little bit more recognizable. It's referred to as the Archaic Age. And that's from about 800 to 480 BC, roughly. This is a term that originates in the 18th century AD from the study of Greek art, where it mainly refers to styles of surface decoration, sculpture, falling between the geometric style that we saw earlier and the classical style that we'll be seeing shortly. So compared to the classical style, the art that appears during this period is archaic. You can see in the image an example of what are called kuroi, and these are statues of young men and women, usually young men. They're very sort of almost two-dimensional. They look rather Egyptian. They don't look very lifelike. They're very rigid, and we'll compare that to some of the later styles that develop. The Greek city-state seems to have been the product of a line of development, if you like, that occurred between the Dark Ages and the Bronze Age. We'll be talking more about the city-state in time to come. So what you have to imagine is not Greece unified, not a nation called Greece, but an area called Hellas, and it's still called Hellas today, although it's a modern nation state today, and multiple little almost kingdoms is perhaps not the right word, and in some cases they are, but a city-state consists of an urban center that probably formed from multiple villages coming together. The Greek word is sunoikismos, it means living together, and forming a single political entity that then controls a larger area around it, a hinterland. Some of them are quite large, so Athens, as we'll see, is a very large city-state controlling most of Attica, the region of Attica, so a large hinterland around it. Some have very small territories. By contrast, Sparta is another, has quite a large territory around it. The polis, the city-states, are developing during this time. And then we know that some actually were founded as colonies. There's a period of colonization that goes on in the Archaic Age, where there's overpopulation. There's such prosperity apparently in some places. There's overpopulation, so they send out colonies elsewhere. Those are obviously built from the ground up, but most of the ones that we're thinking of, like Athens and Thebes and Sparta, develop more or less naturally. Again, with several villages coming together. Greece at the time, very much, and to this day I suppose, very much a kind of seafaring people. A lot of the land in Greece is mountainous. It's hard to get around it, to get through it. Now there are obviously roads and things of that nature, but there weren't back then to the same degree. So it was easier and then many islands in the Mediterranean that are settled. So travel by sea was very important. The Greeks are very much a seafaring people. The next slide illustrates a number of major conflicts. We know that this was a period of conflict. One thing to remember about the Greeks, they were not a very harmonious people. They were usually, if they weren't fighting their neighbors, they were often having civil wars or something along those lines within their own city-states. they were a contentious lot. And so these are some of the battles that we know of, not all of them. There were probably quite a few more. And often it's a case of a city-state versus a city-state. Sometimes it involves, and we know that most city-states at this time are ruled by oligarchies of aristocrats. Most didn't have kings. The Spartans and the Macedonians are the exceptions to that, and the Epeirotes, the people of Epirus. Most didn't have kings, though. Most had an oligarchic council made up of aristocrats who are constantly engaged in fighting with one another. So that could lead to, and did often lead to, civil strife and such things of that nature, as well as wars. And sometimes one city-state and its group of aristocrats coming into another city-state to help restore a monarch or take down one for one of their allies. We'll talk about some of that a bit more later on. But now we get into the classical era. So that's roughly, again, 480 to 323 BC, well, actually precisely 480 to 323 BC. It ends with the death of Alexander the Great in 323, and the next era is called Hellenistic, which I'll talk about in time to come. So the Archaic Age was characterized by a kind of flurry of development in art, science, architecture, all sorts of things. It comes to its maturity in the Classical Age. Athens and Sparta largely dominate the Greek world during this time, although towards the end of that period, the center of power will shift to Thebes and then to the Kingdom of Macedon. But the 5th century in particular is dominated by the Peloponnesian Wars, which we'll come to in a moment. But the classical era, again, characterized by a high degree of sophistication in art and science, literature, philosophy. In fact, many of the things that we take for granted today in Western thought get their origin in the classical period in Greece. But as I say, Greek civilization throughout most of its history, at least since the Minoan Age, has been characterized by extensive conflict. And one of these conflicts, one that's actually quite defining for the Greeks, is the Greco-Persian Wars, just usually referred to as the Persian Wars. And these are the conflicts between the Achaemenid Empire of Persia and the city-states of the Greek world, starting in 499 and lasting until about 449 BC altogether. So this is a complicated set of conflicts, and I don't have time to go into it all now. We will revisit this at a later time, but worth saying, you've got the Persian Empire, which you can see on the map that I put up, and it's large. It's an extensive empire. It extends from, well, Egypt in the west all the way to India, and comes up to its borders, well, to Thrace and eventually to the Kingdom of Macedon itself. The Greeks are on the westernmost border of its empire. The Persians and Greeks are very different people, but the west coast of what's today Turkey, is referred to as Asia Minor at the time, or Ionia, was occupied by Greeks. And these were different city-states containing Greeks, very similar to the Greeks in the west, in mainland Greece. There are stories they were settled by Athenians. It's probably more likely the other way around, but anyway, related very prominently to the Greeks in mainland Greece. These are part of the Persian Empire, and it was very difficult for the Persians to control them. The Persians have a concept of order, arta, they call it. It means the truth, but it has to do with a sort of cosmic order being mimicked or represented on earth through the Persian great king, the Shah, the king of kings, and his empire. Greeks, as I say, are contentious. They fight with each other. Different city-states fight each other, and within the city-states they fight with each other. They're always debating things. They're always coming up with alternative interpretations and arguments and debates. The Persians found this very difficult to deal with, so they would favor one set of aristocrats over another. That could benefit a group of aristocrats, but it could also harm them because it would mean their own people would turn against them. And what's more, the Greeks in mainland Greece were helping out their cousins in Ionia to resist the Persians. So the great king decides he wants to put an end to this, and so he invades Greece, thinking he'll swat away these poor primitive barbarians on the western borders of his empire. And well, as I say, despite the fact that the Greeks are contentious and constantly fighting each other, probably for the first time in their history, they came together to fight the Persians. And several things helped them to win this war. One was that Greek arms, as a result of fighting each other, Greek arms and weapons and armor were superior to those of the Persians. And the landscape of Greece itself, rugged, mountainous, made it very difficult for the large Persian armies, which were accustomed to the plains of Anatolia and other such places, to amass, huge numbers of troops. The Persian tactic was often just about enveloping the enemy. They couldn't really do this in Greece. Pardon me. And so the Greeks defeat the Persians. It's not over, and it won't be over until Alexander the Great will eventually conquer the Persian Empire, but that's in the next century. Persians are still around even after the end of the Persian Wars. They're interfering in Greek politics, allying with one side or the other, helping them out, stirring up trouble. They realize they can't conquer the Greeks, but they're going to continue to exert an influence over them. But the Persian Wars, as I say, are a defining moment for the Greeks, an existential moment where they might have ceased to exist as a distinct culture, but which they won. And it will lead, unfortunately, to the next sort of set of conflicts. If we look at the next set of slides that I put up, or images, you'll see artwork from the classical period, different styles of vase design are identified here. The black and the red figure. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what defines these, except that one group, so the black figure vases, have to do with the figures on them being a kind of glaze, but then they discover what they can do instead is to have the whole thing glazed and then uncover or scrape off the bits where they want to have the figures. It makes them more sharper, so it's a slightly more sophisticated design. These red and black figure vases are mostly used as grave goods, and one theory goes that they sort of recollect gold and silver. So Greeks were accustomed to their silver being tarnished, corroding, and so turning a darker color. Therefore, the red of the unglazed pot versus the black looks like it recollects, at any rate, gold and silver. They didn't have a lot of gold and silver, the classical Greeks, at least not until later, and so rather than use actual gold and silver as grave goods, they would use these things. But all sorts of new techniques are being developed during this period, and you can see the level of sophistication in some of these examples. A lot of the artwork that I'm using in my slides and will continue to use come from the Roman era, but they're based on Greek originals. And again, as with the Minoan and Mycenaean stuff that survives, what we have are poor cousins of what the Greeks would have originally had, which was on canvas. Unfortunately, canvas doesn't survive, so it's wall frescoes, again, mainly from the Roman era. Sculpture is another area in which the Greeks excel. And I've put in the notes information on several sculptors like Phidias, who designed much of the Acropolis, including the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos, Athena the Maiden. And you can see in the slide reconstruction of what that statue would have looked like, as well as the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which was one of his designs as well. They are developing rather true to form representation in sculpture, and obviously some of this is carved in stone. A lot of what we have today are actually Roman copies of Greek originals that were made in bronze. And they created the statues using what's called the lost wax technique. And the idea is you carve a statue out of wax, because wax is actually very easy to carve compared to something like marble, although they could and did carve in marble. But so you carve a statue in wax, you use that to create a mold in something like plaster, and then you pour in your bronze, and the bronze melts the wax but fills up the space that the wax occupied, giving you a statue in bronze that looks like the wax negative, if you like. The next slide illustrates some sculpture, and again, these are Roman copies, but you can see the difference is significant compared to, and these are examples of work by Polyclitus. There's a media file which you can view in the slides on Polyclitus, who seems to have introduced what's called the contrapposto stance, that is sort of a more natural stance. You can see that in the spear bearer, where one leg is in the weight of the body is placed on one leg, as a person might stand in real life. So compare that to the kuroi of the Archaic Age, the very rigid Egyptian-looking statues, as opposed to this, which is much more lifelike, or the discus thrower of Myron, which you can see there as well. And then later work by Praxiteles, which is even more sophisticated. So they're able to recreate in sculpture human form, and they do this using mathematics. It's all down to mathematics and something called the golden rectangle, derived from Pythagorean mathematics. So it's down to science. But whether it's a result of using these sort of golden ratios, or whether it's simply their aesthetic, Greek statues from this period, as you can tell, look better than people do in real life. So there's kind of almost like a cult of the healthy, of the super fit bodies. And you know, most people probably didn't look like that. Even the people being represented might not have looked like that. But there's a tendency to make them look better than they would in real life, almost godlike. But again, the mathematics allow for that. Architecture is another thing that really prospers during this period. So you get the Acropolis itself, which is probably the largest structure that could be built at the time using the technology. And the next group of slides that you'll see come from the Acropolis today, which you can see a reconstruction of it in this one, what it might have looked like. Now, it wasn't built all at once, although it was refurbished under Pericles in the 5th century. Pericles is kind of like the president of Athens, though they didn't have such a title. After the Persians had come in and actually destroyed much of it during their invasion of Greece. But originally the Acropolis, which means city in the air, and then this is what I mean. This was the old Bronze Age palace that then gets refurbished as a religious center. Bits and pieces were added over time. Under Pericles, it gets entirely refurbished, and the temple of Athena Parthenos, the Parthenon, is constructed. It's an elaborate temple complex on the largest hill in the city, so it can be seen from a distance. We have the gates of the Propylaea, flanked by temples, including the temple of Athena Nike, Athena of Victory, and here we have the Erechtheion. This is a remnant of Bronze Age Mycenaean religious practice. There's a snake pit inside it. We know that their religion involved using snakes somehow in worship. Some of the early kings of Athens are said to be descended from, or to have been part snake, including Erechtheus himself. This may have been the original palace of the kings when Athens had kings, probably, although again it's been refurbished, redone by Pericles. You can see the caryatids. These are carved marble statues of goddesses being used as columns. pardon me, some of them in this picture are reconstructed because the originals are in the British Museum. And then there's the Parthenon itself, which, as I said, is probably the largest temple of its type that could be built using this style of architecture. And worth mentioning that it's built without mortar, without concrete. They actually had concrete and mortar. They didn't use it on this, though. And partly the reason it's built this way is to be able to give a little bit when there are earthquakes, and Greece has lots of earthquakes. So a lot of it is actually held in place with what might be called staples. So that there would be a kind of an H-shaped cut in the rock, and then a metal bronze, I believe, again shaped like an H, fitted in there to hold the thing in place, but then allowing it to give. And when the earthquake, it worked very well. The Parthenon was actually intact throughout most of its history. It wasn't until the Napoleonic era when it sort of got involved in the wars that were going on at the time that an explosion caused it to be damaged. So it survived pretty well, which is a testament to their architectural skill. Other structures worth mentioning include the Amphitheater of Dionysus, which is the birthplace of drama, and it, amongst other things, it's an acoustically sound structure, meaning that without modern techniques like microphones and speakers, the actors on stage could be heard in the back row. Roughly 20,000 people could sit there and listen to a play being performed, and they could hear what was being said, even in the back rows, even in a very low voice. Just to give you a sort of a comparison, most modern buildings are not acoustically sound. We depend on technology for sound systems. There are very few examples of acoustically sound structures today. So again, this involves mathematics, and I should have said as well, the Parthenon involved mathematics. It's a very precisely oriented structure, and again, it required mainly Pythagorean theorem to build in that style. This next picture is this rather unassuming marble hill is known as the Pnyx, and that's where the Democratic Assembly of Athens first met. So this little bit of marble on the hill is the birthplace of Western democracy. And there we go. There's a tourist. So architecture really takes off during this period, and won't really be improved upon a great deal, I would say, until relatively modern times. I mean, the Romans come along, they use a lot of concrete and brickwork in their buildings, but again, it's all stuff the Greeks had developed, and it's mostly Greek science. Literature, philosophy, and poetry all take off during this period, and we'll be encountering a number of these in this module. So in terms of philosophy, we have Socrates, who's so important that we distinguish the pre-Socratic philosophers, the ones who come before him, from the ones that come after. He taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it's been said that most of Western philosophy today is just footnotes to Plato, and to some extent I think there's truth in that statement. We'll talk more about philosophy when we come to it. What's the point of philosophy, you might say? Well, part of the point of philosophy is learning how to argue, how to reason, how to use evidence to prove your point. And so we'll be looking at that in some more detail later on. That gets its birth in classical Athens, Western philosophy. It doesn't begin. Well, actually, Western philosophy begins in Ionia, where East met West, where the Greeks met the Persians, and we'll be looking at the pre-Socratics at some point, and how they interacted with Persian culture, and Persian traditions to come up with something entirely new. As it turns out, Ionian philosophy was utterly incompatible with anything the Persians would tolerate, so most of those Ionian philosophers fled to mainland Greece and would encounter people like Socrates and had an influence on him. But modern philosophy gets its start more or less in classical Athens. History writing, the art of the historian, gets its birth in classical Athens, with Herodotus to begin with, and then Thucydides. Herodotus is more of an ethnographer, really, but nonetheless can be argued to be the first historian. Thucydides develops a technique that we still use today, which is to compare sources, to cite your sources where possible, to look at evidence carefully, to sift through what different people have said, and to apply logic and reason and analysis. So the historian's art and science begins with the ancient Greeks and with Thucydides in particular. And drama. We'll be talking about the birth of drama, how it develops, and some of its exemplars. It's amazing to think that prior to the likes of Euripides and Aeschylus and Sophocles and Aristophanes, it just didn't exist. What we think of as a play did not exist. And thanks to these writers, what we have now, our drama, our fiction today, can be seen to derive directly from them. So this is another remarkable achievement of the ancient Greeks. How did they do all these things? This is, it bears asking. There are a number of theories. One is sort of a modern international relations theory called the democratic peace theory, or part and parcel of it, I suppose. The idea is that in a democracy, because there's freedom of speech, and there was in Athens, and because individuals of different classes can contribute, that it becomes a kind of hotbed of learning. Maybe so. Though it is worth pointing out that in terms of science and art, a lot of the same things were also developed by the Chinese, who were ruled by god kings. So, does that hold true? I don't know. But uniquely in ancient Athens, as a result, seemingly, of democracy and of being a crossroads of different cultures, so much developed that we now take for granted that might not have developed under different circumstances. And we'll be talking about these things more in time to come. We talked about the Persian Wars a little bit. I want to mention the Peloponnesian Wars because they are really the defining feature, at least of the latter half of the 5th century. And these wars are between Athens and Sparta, more or less. Well, the ones that most people think of as the Peloponnesian Wars are from 431 to 404, although there was actually an earlier period that concluded in a bit earlier, having to do with war by proxy. But essentially, when the Persians are gone, the Greeks decide they need something to prevent the Persians from coming back. So they form their equivalent of NATO, except they form two of them. They can't all agree to be in the same organization. So there's the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, and Sparta had largely led the Greeks during the Persian Wars, being expert warriors that they were. They have the Peloponnesian League. The Athenians, though, are now becoming quite wealthy, quite a powerful city-state, and they form their own league called the Delian League, or the League of Delos. It's based well, they swear their oath at the sanctuary of Apollo at Delos. The treasury of the league is there, at least until Pericles moves it in 454. Anyway, one group, the Spartans, favor kingship and oligarchy as the type of government. They promote that in their subject cities. The other, Athens, favors democracy and actively promotes democracies against kingship and oligarchy in their cities. So it's almost like a Cold War develops between Sparta and and Athens. Now, the leagues are not initially founded to be empires. They're mutual defense pacts. The Spartan one, we'll look at these in more detail, but the Spartan one is sort of all of the different members are more or less subject to Sparta, but Sparta leaves them alone so long as they don't start setting up democracies, and can call upon them to send troops if need be. The Athenian one is a lot more integrated. Initially, their allies, and they're called allies, are meant to contribute troops and ships, but because Athens is at the hub of a trading empire, it's better suited to build ships and raise troops than a lot of other city-states that are members of its league. So in the end, a lot of them just end up giving money to Athens for their contribution, with the exception of Lesbos, the island of Lesbos, which was wealthy enough to contribute ships and troops, at least until they tried to defect from the league. Anyway, we'll come to that in time to come. The result of all this money pouring into Athens, not all of it needs to be spent on defense. The Athenians use it for other things. They use it to become incredibly wealthy. At any rate, you have two, and their league, the Delian League, will become an empire. The people who are members of it start off being called allies, Sumakoi, those who fight together. Later, they're referred to as subjects of Athens. So the rhetoric changes, and Athens starts ruling them in a more heavy-handed way. We'll come back to that later, but what starts off as a kind of war by proxy between Athens and Sparta, between their allies, spills over into an actual hot war, if you like, between Athens and Sparta. Athens is mostly a sea-based power. Sparta is land-based. And the two don't really make a lot of headway against each other. Athens probably should have won the Peloponnesian Wars. They had more resources. They had a larger, wealthier territory. They had the ships. But there were a number of errors made, partly because the fledgling democracy of Athens lacked what most modern states have, which is a foreign policy executive. And so foreign policy decisions were made in Athens by the assembly, by popular vote. And every male citizen of Athens was a member of the assembly. So you've got the entire adult male population deciding on matters of foreign policy. You can see how that would be problematic. That's part of it. They make a number of errors, perhaps get a bit greedy. The war could have been concluded on peaceful terms earlier, but there are lots of hawks in the Athenian assembly, and they press onwards. And then the Persians get involved, and they help the Spartans out by giving them gold to build ships and supply them with other things. And there are some defectors from Athens, too, who help the Spartans. So in the end, the Spartans will defeat the Athenians in 404 BC. And that's the end of the first Athenian Empire. There's actually a second empire that comes in the 4th century. Athens isn't completely destroyed by Sparta. Sparta respects Athens. Athens was seen as a center of culture and civilization and art and architecture and philosophy, so the Spartans could have destroyed them. It was customary, in fact, when a city-state defeated another in warfare to raze them to the ground, to raze the city to the ground and to sell all the inhabitants as slaves, usually to kill all the adult males. Athens was not treated thusly by Sparta, and Athens would rise again as an albeit lesser power. I've put up the phases of the war. The Archidamian from 431 to 421, the Peace of Nicias, 421 to 415, and the Decalaean or Ionian War from 415 to 404. And as I say, we'll be looking at this in more detail in time to come. It's a war Athens probably should have won or could have been concluded peacefully, but wasn't. And we'll think about the consequences of that. Well, and the upshot of that, you can see, for example, one of the things the Athenians did was build the long walls. So Athens is the capital of Attica. It is the city-state, the urban center, but then the Piraeus is the main port. It's some distance away. about 8 miles, I think. And because Athens is a maritime power, they have a fleet. The fleet is essential. So they build these long walls connecting up the walled city of Athens to the walled Piraeus. And that it's Fortress Attica. The Spartans cannot penetrate these defenses, and the fleet can go in and out as they please, land troops to defend if the Spartans are ravaging the countryside, which they do quite a lot. In the end, it comes down to the Spartans cutting off their grain supply, and the city can't feed itself, and also defeating their fleet at a major naval battle. Sparta will be the dominant power in Greece for a while, but we'll see when we look at Sparta, they seem to have been a rather inward-looking society, and don't seem to have been as keen on empire as the Athenians were. So they become embroiled in internal affairs, pardon me, and withdraw eventually, and will get defeated at the Battle of Leuctra by the 371 by the Thebans. The Thebans learn a lesson from the Spartans. The Spartans are successful soldiers because they have a state-run, state-paid-for military. Well, every male citizen is a member of the army. Thebes doesn't quite go that far, but they sponsor a state-paid-for military called the Sacred Band of the 300. These then train other soldiers, and so a professional standing army. The problem with Sparta was always population. They were such an exclusive society. There were never that many full Spartan citizens, and so usually their battles were fought by allies and mercenaries with the Spartans leading them. The Thebans can field larger armies of professional soldiers, and they'll defeat the Spartans at Leuctra, and they will be the dominant power in Greece for quite some time. But then comes along the kingdom of Macedon. Philip II, who would become Philip II, had been a prisoner in Thebes. He studied their techniques, replicated those for the kingdom of Macedon, but did it on an even grander scale, used new technologies, combined arms approach, and would defeat the Thebans, the Battle of Chaeronea in 338. And that would end Theban hegemony to replace by Macedonian supremacy. And the Macedonians will unify Greece for the first time ever as a single entity under the kingdom of Macedon before they go off to fight the Persians. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of a potted history, if you like, of the conflicts and the shifting power structures of the 5th to 4th century BC. So I've put a picture of the Alexander mosaic, his defeat of Darius at the Battle of Issus, again from a Roman copy of a Greek original, which you can see there. Now, just a few words about studying ancient history. You're looking at primary sources. Read them carefully. They were written in an age where there were no electronic media, and for a culture that no longer exists. If you don't understand what you've read, read it again. If there are words or references that you don't understand, you've got Google, use it. Look up the words, look up the references. This was written for a different culture at a different time. It's been translated into English. The translations themselves vary in quality. Do your best. Every line that you're reading has been commented upon, interpreted for the past 2.5 millennia. There is scholarship on everything that we're doing. So if you for your essays, but also for just your own understanding, look at some of the secondary scholarship. Every word that you're going to be reading, somebody has commented upon. It's an unfortunate fact that we think only about 1% of the texts produced in the ancient world survive. Now, that 1% that we have today is probably the best of the best. We have references to a lot of other stuff that doesn't survive. So we are privileged to have this information. Treat it as such. Treat it as a privilege, and do your best to try and understand it. Look up. don't reinvent the wheel. As I say, somebody's written something about whatever we're reading. At the very least, before you start embarking on a new subject that we're dealing with in class, look it up on Wikipedia. Read a general article, something about it. Otherwise, it's not going to make that much sense to you. You need the context. You need these references explained. There's a wealth of secondary historiography scholarship in the library. Use this for your own purposes in your essays, but make frequent recourse to the primary sources. I'll say this now: when you're writing your essays, primary sources are your evidence. I don't want you quoting secondary sources all the time. Quote them sparingly. Quote primary sources, because the secondary sources are using the primary sources. As historians, we're interested in evidence. Keep an open mind. Ancient Greece is a very different world from our own. You probably won't find it instantly accessible. But if you work hard, read far and wide, you'll come to some sort of accommodation which will, I think, enrich you quite a bit as a consequence. Thank you very much for your attention. That concludes this lecture on who were the Greeks. Hopefully I've explained that to an extent. And I shall see you for the seminar. Bye for now.